The oil and gas industry has rebounded strongly throughout 2021, with oil prices reaching their highest levels in 6 years. Yes, while the industry recovery is better than expected, uncertainty remains over market dynamics in the coming years. Now, oil prices have been rising since the start of 2021, boosted by recovery in demand and capped supply from OPEC. Oil prices recovered around 80 barrels per dollar. That's $80 per barrel, I beg your pardon, after turning negative in April 2020. In Nigeria, despite the lingering COVID-19 pandemic and the uncertainty in the outlook of fossil fuels, the Nigerian oil and gas industry recorded a modest growth in the first 9 months of 2021. Now, the improvement in the sector can be attributed to the increase in international oil prices and the rapid pace at which the rapid pace of economic recovery buoyed by easing of mobility restrictions. Now, joining me to review this virtually is a partner at CanHelp and the director, Aspen Energy, Mr. Israel Aye. Good afternoon, Mr. Aye, and it's good to see you. Compliments of the season.
Good afternoon, Tolu, and compliments of the season to you and your crew.
Thank you,
TVC.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, it's a holiday, but we are here, and thank you also for spending your time with us this afternoon. I'm going to start with my introduction. Before pre-COVID-19, we knew what was happening with the oil market and the high expectations. But one way COVID struck, and we saw what happened immediately, the effect on it. Give us an overview of the market pre and where we are at the moment.
Well, I mean, referencing the evolution or perhaps the development in the oil markets or the petroleum sector globally to COVID is a bit, in my opinion, of an artificial thing. At best, COVID was something of an accelerator or perhaps just an intervening event. The things that were probably driving change in the petroleum industry globally prior to COVID and continue to drive it even now would be definitely things around the oil, the demand and supply dynamics. Essentially what had happened was that some of the traditional buyers in the Atlantic Basin had come into significant supply themselves, notably the United States of America on the back of shale and the likes of it. And so that altered a bit of the demand and supply dynamics, such that the producers along the Atlantic Basin, such as Nigeria, lost those markets and had to look for other markets. Some of the other things, and of course, the shale revolution, if you may call it that way, which is what altered the supply dynamics, would definitely be one of those big things that was shaping the market pre-COVID. Something else that started to shape the market pre-COVID was definitely the energy transition, which crystallized in the COP26 conference in Glasgow, to whatever extent, and there are different points of view as far as that is concerned. And then, of course, still on the supply side of things, is that technology had advanced to the extent that we have started to find oil in places we didn't think we could find oil. And so all of these together have combined to drive change in that particular sector. That was definitely pre-COVID, continues to be the case during COVID. I think that the COVID phenomenon, or perhaps COVID impact, was a bit of an artificial intervention. And as we see post-COVID, the markets are rebounding, and we're seeing something that is a bit more normal.
A very good way to start there, Mr. Israel. Now, OPEC and OPEC Plus, very immediately, there was this, ups and downs, back and forth, and all of that. Even with the UAE at that time, which you came in to help us also understand. Now, there's a gradual increase in production and all of that, which is also going to affect Nigeria. I'm looking at Omicron now showing up at this time. Many are saying that there could be an effect because demand could drop. Do you think this will happen, particularly at this time where we're looking at the positive impact already on the pricing at the moment?
I mean, you talked about OPEC and OPEC Plus, and I recall, somebody, a very close friend of mine whom you know as well, say that he had traditionally been a critic of OPEC as a concept as well as an organization, and perhaps didn't see why Nigeria chose to belong to an organization like OPEC, especially since it constrains the amount of crude you can produce to the market. But everybody would agree that the intervention of OPEC Plus, as they referred to, helped to save the market at a time when there was a glut in the market, when we had the COVID event, the lockdown internationally, and some of the heavy users of petroleum products basically just were not in a position to use it. I mean, air travel was down, energy production, a whole lot of those things were down, and that affected the market in many ways. And it took the intervention of OPEC to cut supply in order to stabilize the market. But post the event, the market is stabilizing on its own. But listen, the period we're in is what you might refer to as the VUCA period. I mean, there's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and from day to day, it's literally impossible to tell what's going to happen. Will Omicron snowball into a catastrophe similar to what we saw early last year? Are we going to have mass lockdowns again? I mean, if I knew that, I probably would not be, probably won't be monetizing it at some point. But look, it is what it is. Does not take away from the point we made earlier that even if Omicron were to snowball into that sort of phenomenon, then it would also still be a short-term intervention. But the sensible thing to do is to keep our eyes on the ball, eyes on the fundamentals, essentially to look at those sort of long-term factors that are impacting the industry, to understand their impact in the industry and how we should respond. And that's really it, so that we're not given to short-termism, but we're thinking and acting a bit more long-term, rather than just reacting to situations such as Omicron. I mean, what would Omicron do? Lead to a lockdown? Lockdown will last how long? Already, the science around Omicron is indicating that, yes, it might have a high infection rate, but low mortality rate. So, at the end of the day, we hope that it is nothing more than a Delta type scare, and overall, the world would be able to deal with the coronavirus as a phenomenon generally, and we'll get past it. But as for the things that are shaping the industry globally, those are not going away. So the sensible thing to do is to stay with the fundamentals and let those drive our long-term planning, while we stay flexible and agile to be able to respond to the things that come to us in the short term.
Very importantly, if we are to talk about the sector, Mr. Israel, you agree with me that we must mention the PIA, because that's something very strategic that happened this year, and everyone will talk about that. Though for me, we expect the positives to start coming in one way or the other. But let's look at that with regards to activities of the downstream and some other activities. What's your assessment of that level, the passage of the PIA, and of course other issues around refining and of course subsidy issues?
Well, generally, I mean, and it's a good thing you mentioned this. You remember how long it took for us to get to the PIA. I mean, the PIB as a phenomenon was around for, depending on who is counting, some people tell you 20 years, some people tell you it was 12 years, but from when it was, from when we signaled to the world that we were about to change the legal regime of the petroleum industry, it took a total of about 21 years. And to the eternal credit of this particular regime, they were able to pass it. And so we have the PIA, but we operate in an industry that has long gestations. It's like a large ship. If you change course, it is unlikely that you're going to see the effect of the change of course immediately. Unfortunately, we appear to be going through what I consider a tedious and a rather slow transition. The regulators would seem not to have settled in or settled down. We would like to see a lot more activity and direction from the regulators who have an increased sort of role in the current in the present dispensation and the likes of it. Now, with regards to downstream operations, with regards to refining and the likes of it, unless some of the fundamentals change, unless some of the policy positions change, it is unlikely that you would see the kind of acceleration Nigerians expect. I mean, for example, until now, even though the law now says that we must deregulate and which would ultimately lead to importation by private importation of petroleum products by private operators and the likes of it. But up till now, NNPC is still the only licensed importer of crude, and some of the companies that have licensed to refine are yet to take. I mean, are yet to come on stream. Those things don't happen overnight, so it's gonna take a while for us to see those kinds of impact. Okay. It's going to take a while for us to see that impact. But what we should be looking for is progress. And progress for me would be at least to see clarity in terms of the policy first, and absolute clarity in terms of guidance from the regulators. I'd like to see the chief executive officers of the commission and the authority, come out and make very definitive statements about the direction in which we're going as a country. And let me say something. I mean, we talk a lot about the PIA, and just to pivot a bit, and it probably links to something else you might be talking about later. But we talk a lot about the PIA and the potential impact on the petroleum industry. But I think that our focus on the petroleum industry is a bit too narrow. And quite frankly, I would want to advocate that we should start to look at the larger subject of an energy policy, of which the petroleum industry is a subset. Because when you're talking about the energy transition, when you're talking about you're talking about the need to generate more power, you're talking about the broad spectrum of the issues we're addressing on this call. What is apparent to me is the need to have an overarching energy policy. And maybe it is time that we're looking more at a minister in charge of energy rather than a minister in charge of petroleum. And then petroleum will be a subset of our energy policy, overarching, so as to keep in step with the rest of the world. Otherwise, we will be micromanaging a phenomenon that is past and losing sight of, of how the rest of the world is evolving.
Great stuff. There. Now, you talked on the COP26, and I see this gradual shift away from fossil fuel. All countries are coming together at this time, climate issues and all of that. So what effect do you think that could have on our oil and gas industry?
Well, again, that's the point I was making earlier on about the need to have an overarching energy policy. I mean, Nigeria's presentation at the COP26 effectively was an undertaking that we were going to produce more of our electricity requirement from solar energy, and we're going to accelerate gas-powered plants and the likes of it. I mean, that for me is neither here nor there. But what's the potential of impact of COP26 on Nigeria? If you listen to the advocacy by a lot of the African countries about being bullied to toe the line with respect to the energy transition agenda, you see, my attitude is simply this: if the rest of the world, particularly the bloc that constitutes the bulk of the demand, or the bulk of the demand, are pivoting away from fossil fuel, the use of fossil fuel, there are two ways they're impacting the petroleum industry. One, they're defunding new projects. It's become a lot more strenuous to find funds for new projects. Two, potentially in years to come, sometime around 2035, as estimated by a lot of people, demands might begin to decline. Now, if you have that sort of situation, what does it mean for Nigeria? For me, it does not mean that we stop the production of fossil fuel. But what it could mean is that fossil fuel as a super earner of foreign exchange might not be available to us anymore. And that's probably the way to look at it. To think, is that fossil fuel as that sort of super commodity that earns the bulk of Nigeria's foreign exchange might begin to decline at some point in the future. So what should we be looking to do? In my opinion, what we should be looking to do is to maximize our production in the short term, to get whatever value we can, to accelerate, what we can get out of that, and use it to fund an infrastructure economy going forward. And then to begin to think of the day when the bulk of the fossil fuel produced in this country will be used to develop this country. Now, it is at that point that we can begin to make the argument that the rest of the world cannot impose their their energy transition agenda on Africa. After all, it is only in this, it's only this year that the UK stopped to produce power with coal. And coal has been labeled dirty fuel over many years. So I anticipate that in decades to come, honestly, I'll probably go as far on a limb to say around 50 to 100 years, fossil fuel will still remain relevant. However, its time as a super commodity that earns that kind of easy capital is numbered. And that's the way Nigeria ought to think about it. And in those circumstances, what should we be doing? That's where I talk about an overarching energy policy, where we're not only thinking in terms of maximizing the value or benefits from petroleum products, but we're also thinking in terms of how to leapfrog the rest of the world in terms of the energy transition. The energy transition shouldn't strike fear in our hearts. It should really present to us an opportunity. So we really are in a position that with very careful thinking, planning, and execution, we can eat our cake and have it. But the problem right now is that we're in this reactive mode, and we just really need to rethink it. PI is a great thing. It happened, and we're grateful for it. But unfortunately, it came, in my opinion, many years too late. But thank God we've done it. What we should be moving to very quickly is to think in terms of the broader subject, to get an overarching energy policy that takes into consideration all the developments that we've mentioned and more.
Well, it's a good way to leave it. I must thank you so much. Interesting conversation with Mr. Israel Aye there. Time flies, especially when you're making sense. Thank you so much. Partner, Can't Help, and Director at Aspen Energy, Mr. Israel Aye. Do enjoy the rest of your day. And of course, a Happy New Year in advance.
Here's wishing you a happy 2022. Thank you very much for the great job you're doing at TVC. God bless you.
I appreciate that.